Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Dan Gullery. I'm the test prep director at Max Learning Space. I am just going to wait a few more minutes in case a few more people show up. I don't want to keep you all waiting for those of you who are here on time. I would like to know, though, I did see some responses from the questions that were asked when you registered for the webinar. If anybody would like to let me know either in the chat or the Q&A, which schools in particular you are looking at applying to, whether any of them are, I'll get into which ones use the SSAT and which ones don't, but I'm certainly interested to know if there are certain schools that I should talk a little bit more about and certain schools that maybe don't need as much of a discussion. Okay, cool. So I see a couple of pretty common ones, a couple for St. Mike's, a couple for UCC, UTS. So some of these schools do use the SSAT still, some of them don't. So we'll talk about sort of all of the tests as we go along. For now, like I said, I'm going to wait maybe 2 more minutes just in case a few more people show up and, just give them the opportunity to jump on. Okay, cool. We have a Baby Glen, and Baby Glen is actually one that I don't have on my list, although I should in terms of my list for the presentation, but I can still talk a little bit about it. Okay, so I am going to get started. Welcome to those of you who are just joining. If you'd like to throw in the Q&A the names of the schools that you're looking at applying to, I'm happy to sort of cater a little bit more towards certain schools. If there are some schools that nobody's looking at, then I won't even need to talk about them, but I'm going to just sort of balance it out between SSAT and general private school admissions. So like I said, my name is Dan Gullery. I'm the test prep director at Max Learning Space. That's been my role for about 5 years now. And so what I do a lot of is talking to parents about prospective schools, working with kids in terms of their preparation for the entrance tests, and talking or doing some talking, doing a lot of research in terms of the changing nature of testing and what schools are looking at, and sort of the individual schools where they're gravitating towards in recent years. So just to give you a little bit of an idea of what this evening will look like, my plan is to end by 8, and that includes question and answers. Of course, I'm happy to go over that, but I don't want to keep anybody longer than necessary. So I aim to sort of have my presentation done by about 7:30 and then open the floor to any questions. So we'll just start with some general information. I will talk about accommodations for tests, although that is not in the correct order. I will be talking about that after a few other things. The SSAT I'll talk a little bit about. There are quite a few people in the Q&A who've mentioned schools that require the SSAT, so I do want to give that justice. I'll talk a little bit about the private school admissions tests and what they look like in general, and then what preparation looks like. So we'll start with the SSAT. It's sort of the the one that more people or more schools use. It's the secondary school admissions test, although it's also used for middle school. And in fact, there is an elementary version that's used in the States. It's not used by any school in Canada. So we don't really talk about the elementary SSAT here. It's really just middle school for kids who are applying to grades 7 and 8, and high school for students applying for grades 9 through 12. The bulk of the students who write the middle test are in grade 6, applying to grade 7, and the bulk of the students who write the upper test are in grade 8, applying to grade 9. And those tests happen in the fall. So if your kid is starting grade 6 this fall, your kid will take the SSAT usually October or November of their grade 6 year. So about 5-6 months from now. Testing options. So traditionally, the test was only written on paper in a school that offered the test. It wasn't that you had to write it at the school that you were applying to, but only certain schools in the Toronto area offered the test. Now, the entire test can be done at home, which is the more popular option at this point. Students will log in usually either at about 9 a.m. or about 2 p.m. Because of the time zone differences. They're just offering those 2 times as tests. And they do the 3-hour test on the computer with a live proctor who is just sort of monitoring a group of kids who are writing it. You can take up to 3 of those per school year. The in-person tests, the paper tests are still done. You can do 6 of them in a year. And obviously there are also prometric centers where it's sort of like if you were doing, like a degree program and you needed a certification, you would go to a center where there are cubicles with computers, you would sit down and you would do the proctored test there. But that's the least popular option. There is also a flex test. I don't want to get too much into the whole flex test thing because it is a really confusing option. There's no difference between a paper test, a flex test, and an online test in terms of the content. Flex test is just a word that they use for unofficially scheduled in-person tests. So certain schools do offer them if they have a higher than normal number of students who are looking to take the test at that school. That's really all it is. Or if it's through a private proctor. So what's on the SSAT? And this is actually relevant to all of the tests with the exception of one section. So every school admissions test will look at the quantitative in terms of math. Actually, because somebody mentioned Baby Glen, I will say if you're applying to Baby Glen for high school, all they do is write an essay. But if you're applying to really any other school, you will be tested on your math competency. On the SSAT, it's fairly difficult math in terms of what kind or what level they're looking at. If you're in grade 6, you will see questions that are looking at 2- and 3-step algebra. You'll be seeing Pythagorean theorem. There are questions about angles and things that really aren't taught explicitly to students until much later. Even for students who are doing things like Spirit of Math, they will often find that the questions on the SSAT are much more difficult than they're expecting because they're taken out of context. And oftentimes kids are asked a question and the first thing that they need to do is figure out what to do before they can actually put any of the skills that they have to use. So it's an hour of math on the SSAT in 2 separate sections. So they just break it up so that you don't have to do an hour of math straight, which I guess is one of the few nice things that they do in terms of writing the SSAT. The reading section is 40 questions. It's about 7 or 8 passages, and you have 40 minutes to do it. It's a mix of questions. This is a similar section to many of the internal private school admissions tests in terms of reading something and answering some questions based on what you've read. Again, with the SSAT, it is generally harder than any private school admissions test will be. And when I say private school admissions tests, let me be clear, I'm speaking about individual schools putting together their own tests for admissions. Although the SSAT is obviously written as private school admissions, that's sort of how I distinguish them as SSAT and private school tests, single private school, sort of in-house tests. The verbal section is unique to the SSAT. So if you are not taking the SSAT, you will not have to learn new vocabulary words, which is a blessing, although it's always nice to have a wider vocab. But in terms of doing the SSAT, there are 60 vocab questions. They're extremely challenging words. Most kids struggle with, I would say, 40 of those 60 words in terms of actually answering the question. It just takes time and practice to really start to learn new words, but also understand how words are put together, what a prefix and a suffix are, what root words are, how they sort of work with each other. But again, with a test like this, they do often throw in words that look like it has a particular root word, but actually doesn't. And then finally, you have the writing sample. Actually, on the SSAT, that's the first section. So I really shouldn't say finally, but the writing sample is done by anybody who's taking the SSAT, so middle or upper level. On the middle level, you're given a creative prompt and an essay prompt. So the creative prompt might be something like her eyes widened with delight when she saw ... And so you're meant to sort of come up with a story based on that. The essay prompt is usually something along the lines of, if I was in charge of my school for a day, I would change 3 things, and here's what they are. The upper level test is 2 essay questions. So rather than having a creative prompt, you're just given 2 essay questions to choose from. One of them is generally more personal, and one of them is more global. So that's sort of the distinction that they make. And then in terms of the scoring, I don't want to get too much into the nitty-gritty here, although I'm happy to answer questions at the end. The raw score is basically just how many questions you answered correctly minus a quarter mark for every incorrect answer. Skipped questions are not penalized. So, in terms of getting an extremely high mark, most of those kids who are placing in the 90th, 95th percentile are really not answering any questions incorrectly, and they're using strategies so that they're maximizing the number of correct answers, minimizing the number of incorrect answers, and really just relying on, maximizing the number of correct answers, minimizing the number of incorrect answers, and really just skipping those few questions that they're not quite sure about. So I do see a question here in terms of preparation time for the SSAT. I am going to talk about that in just a few moments. So in terms of the scaled score, that's just an inflated number that they give you. And the percentile ranking is really what most of the schools are looking at. Because it's graded on a percentile, somebody has to be at the 1st percentile and somebody's at the 99th percentile. Most kids fall somewhere in the middle. On your first test, if you are going in blind, you will, even if you're an A student, and I don't mean to say this to scare anybody, but even an A student will generally fall at around the 20th percentile on their first test. And it's not because they don't know the material necessarily, although obviously there is material on this test that kids just have not learned yet because of the nature of the test. But it's also that, the questions are tricky, the answer choices are there to trick you. There are just a lot of things that happen with the test that kids are really not ready for without, and I don't mean to say that, intensive preparation is the only way to go, but without at least knowing something about the test and doing a little bit of practice before they go in. Schools, so let me be clear about this, a good score. So 90th percentile is like out of the ballpark for Toronto area. The only schools that are looking at anything above the 90th percentile are schools in the United States. Those schools have just a higher level of competition, and the nature of test prep is different in the United States, which is more of a common thing that people do. UTS, which is sort of considered the most challenging school to get into in Toronto, 90th percentile is the 90th percentile, so 90 is really like the higher standard for upper level students. 80th percentile is generally the standard for middle level students. That's not to say that if you place in the 80th percentile and you're looking at UTS that you'll automatically be invited back for an interview, but it certainly does increase your chances in terms of being invited back. So if you're looking at a school like De La Salle, so actually De La Salle doesn't use the SSAT anymore as of this year. As of last year, they've started using their own test, and I'll talk about that as well. But if you're looking at a school like St. Mike's, for example, St. Michael's College, a score in the 50th percentile is certainly nothing that they won't disregard that score. They won't say this is awful, we won't take this. 50th percentile, the way that can be interpreted by somebody who's looked at this test year after year is not that this kid only knows half of what he should know or she should know. Neither is it, nor is it that, this kid is only doing better than 50% of the other kids who are taking this test. What it really means is this kid is coming from a Canadian school system, and their score is being compared to most of the scores that they're comparing them to are kids in the US, where the nature of test prep is different, and a lot of those schools need 95th percentile, and those kids are prepping for a full year, sometimes 2 full years. And some of those feeder schools that go into the middle schools and high schools that require this test are doing in-house test preparation for a full year in grade 5 before they write the test in grade 6. So to compare your child to those kids is completely unfair, and the schools who use the SSAT in Toronto know that. Actually, the schools that use the SSAT in Canada know that. Not just Toronto. So, obviously we want to give, a kid the best opportunity to move forward and to be accepted into school. And even if 50th percentile is sometimes, it's a huge improvement from where a lot of kids are starting. Like I said, it sometimes could be at the 10th or 20th percentile. What makes it so challenging? So again, really advanced concepts in math, difficult reading passages, advanced vocab words, limited timing, trick questions, and point deductions. Point deductions are not something that you have to worry about if you're looking at an independent, or sorry, a private school who's doing their own independent test. No school will do point deductions. As far as I know, they haven't changed that for this year, so no school is doing that. It's only the SSAT that you lose marks for wrong answers. So let's talk about accommodations, and this applies to SSAT and any other school that you're applying to. If your child gets accommodations in schools, please apply for accommodations on this test. There are no penalties for accommodations. There is no sort of checkbox that's sort of like, this kid got extra time or something like that. If your kid gets accommodations, please apply for accommodations on the test. You must do it for the SSAT before you register. What they'll do is they'll ask you for a contact person at the school that your child attends. The SSAT will contact that person and have that person forward documentation to them, and then the accommodation will be accepted. Generally speaking, the most common accommodations for any test are 1.5 times. So if it's an hour long, your child will get it an hour and a half. Use of a calculator. A lot of the in-school tests do allow kids to use a calculator for at least part of it. The SSAT doesn't. The note just sort of, that I put here, it sounds beneficial, but if you don't know how to do the math, a calculator isn't going to help you. So, it helps in some way, but it's not, a free pass for a kid who gets to use a calculator. And then the other one is a smaller testing environment. Some kids do get things in school like a scribe or a reader. Those things can be admissible on the SSAT or other tests, but they do, you are charged for those things. So you're required to find your own scribe or reader and pay that person for the time. They don't provide that to you. And there also are some regulations about who is allowed to be a scribe or a reader, or who is allowed to be a stand-in adult during your kid's test. So again, if there are questions about that, I'm happy to answer. Okay, so let's look at the schools, and then I will talk about preparation. So UTS, St. Clement School, Toronto French School, Abelard, St. Mike's, and St. Andrews require the SSAT. If you're looking at TFS, Toronto French School, and your child is already in a full French program, they don't have to take the SSAT. They still have to do the character snapshot skills, which is just a sort of like a personality questionnaire. It's really not a big deal, but it's part of the SSAT suite. The UTS, as of last year or the year before, I think it was just last year though, they started accepting the ISEE in lieu of the SSAT. ISEE is the Independent School Entrance Exam. It's used more so in the UK and parts of the US. It's just as hard as the SSAT. I think the reason that they opened it up is just that they wanted to give kids more of an opportunity to actually take a test when test centers and test dates were full. It's not an easier test. It's basically the same test with the exception of the format of 2 of the sections, but the content itself is the same. So Crescent School, Royal St. George's, and Upper Canada College, UCC, share an in-house test. It's one test that's administered by all 3 schools. And if you're applying to all 3 schools, you only need to sit one test because they all accept that same in-house test. Branksome Hall, if you're doing middle school, is interview and a portfolio. There is no test for middle. If you're doing Branksome Hall for upper, for high school, you can either do the SSAT or their own in-house test that they designed. De La Salle, as of last year, has moved away from the SSAT, but their test is designed to be exactly identical to the SSAT. They're just cutting ties with the organization itself. The test itself is just as hard. It's the same length. The sections of the test are the same number of questions and the same amount of time. BSS has their own in-house test. And then I should also mention that Baby Glen, if you're upper, you're only writing an essay. If you're middle, so applying to grades 7 or 8, actually I think grade 6 is included in this as well, you do their internal assessment as well as an interview, obviously. Greenwood College School and York School only use the character snapshot skills as well as a report card, and Havergal does an assessment during the interview. So it's an interview where they're asking questions about you and also asking you comprehension questions and things like that, which can be extremely nerve-wracking for kids. So the only one that I didn't get too much into is the Abelard School. It's a small school in downtown Toronto. Not many kids apply there, but if you are looking at Abelard, they do use the SSAT, although it's their own version. So you will not have to do a verbal section, but there's a heavier emphasis on the essay. So the verbal section on the SSAT is the vocab section. But there's an extremely heavy emphasis on the essay, and they also look at a portfolio for admissions. Okay, so that's my whole spiel about the schools and the tests and everything like that. Now what I want to talk about is, actually, I do want to talk about the interview step first, and then we'll talk about a few little things about the private school test, and then we'll talk about preparation. So admissions interviews are big. You know, really all it is a chance to get to know your kid. Most kids fare okay on an interview. Really, you know, it's not that they're looking to see, you know, who is sort of like going to be a problem for their school. They just want to get to know the kid. But really, you know, kids do have a hard time speaking to adults that they don't know. And in particular, kids have in some ways been trained to not brag. And so sometimes speaking, you know, if you're a grade 5 or grade 6 kid, talking about the things that you're proud of, I've worked with a lot of kids who shy away from talking about things that really, really are impressive because they don't want to seem like they're bragging. So, you know, doing admissions prep is not necessarily, or interview prep is not necessarily training a kid what to say at all. What we're really doing is just practicing. You know, here's a kind of question that you might be asked about yourself. What are some things that you could talk about here? So we're really just getting, you know, some back pocket talking points for kids to be ready to pull out and discuss. We're also looking at keeping eye contact. Most of the interviews are still being done virtually. So, you know, it is difficult to, and I do it too. I watch myself talking as if I'm, you know, the most amazing person in the world rather than looking into the camera. And it's been 2.5 years of this, but, you know, it's still something that we talk about with kids in terms of, you know, looking into the camera and making sure that you're keeping eye contact if you can. And then obviously eliminating filler words and dead air. You know, a lot of kids, and I'll be the first to admit that I say and you know, way too often. But you know, when you have 5 minutes to speak to somebody and a lot is on the line, you really want to make sure that every word that you say counts. Okay, so that's really the admissions sort of ins and outs. Just in terms of the SSAT and private test, the differences. There's no vocab section. They're shorter. And most of them can only be taken once. So that is another big difference. The math concepts can be quite advanced, but not quite as advanced as the SSAT. And most of them are done on site, although some are still done virtually. So what's actually on the bulk of the admissions private school, the individual private school tests? Math and literacy, that's it. So you're looking at concepts up to and just above grade level, a lot of word problems, some visual puzzles, and some of them allow calculators. For the literacy, you're looking at reading comprehension and a personal essay prompt. Generally, that is the universal for all of the schools that do their own in-house tests. There are some slight variations, but for the most part, this is what we're looking at. And generally speaking, they're somewhere around 45 minutes to an hour. Some of them are a little bit longer. Okay, so let's talk about what test prep is, because it is very different for a kid than it is for even a high school student who's going to the US and is taking the SAT or the ACT, or, you know, moreover, an adult who's doing the LSAT or the MCAT or something like that. By the time you are finishing high school, if you're lucky, you have your executive functioning control a little bit, you know, you're a little bit more put together is what I'm saying. So you have the ability to sort of self-assess and look and see, what am I doing right? What am I doing wrong? What do I need to spend more time on? How am I making these mistakes? For the LSAT and things like that, you're finished with university. Hopefully at that point, you've gotten even better at that. And so a lot of self-guided study is okay for in a lot of instances for those grade levels. For grade 6 students in particular, and grade 8 students, I should say, really, I mean, this is for middle school and high school. A lot of kids really don't have experience with tests at all at this point. A lot of kids have not been asked to do things like figure out how to prioritize one thing over another, figure out how to do things within a certain amount of time. A lot of kids are used to being able to ask for extra time and being given it. A lot of kids are used to being given tests, and this is the big thing. A lot of kids are used to being given tests that ask them to replicate what they've learned. And this is something where students who do well in school find, many students find a lot of comfort in. If I pay attention, if I do my homework, if I'm a good student, I will do well on the test because I've learned it. And now I'm just showing my teacher that I've learned it. This test doesn't do that. They might start with a question that if you're in grade 6 is not a concept that's taught until grade 9. And question number one can throw kids for a loop. And a lot of kids end up in tears after the first question or the first 5 questions of the test. And the emotional part of test prep is really a huge part of working with kids and getting them ready for this kind of test. It's a high stress environment that kids are in. They know that a lot rides on this test. They know that other kids who are competing for spots are also really good students. And 2 things can happen. One thing that happens is kids will shut down. Another thing that will happen, and this happens quite often as well, is that kids will sort of overinflate their own ego and will not humble themselves in the way they need to for this test, in terms of understanding that there are things that they do not know and things that will take time for them to learn, and also things that they don't need to learn. Even though they might see a concept on a test, on one practice test that they do, they don't need to become a master of Pythagorean theorem to do the middle level SSAT, because that will take time. That takes a full lesson, a full 1-hour lesson to teach, and weeks to practice, and time is precious. So it really is about prioritizing certain things over other things in terms of question types and concepts that are on the test. So, just in terms of getting started, and, this is a nice spiel about our teachers, obviously full-time, we're all full-time at Max Learning Space. So any teacher that your child would be working with is a full-time employee. They have time in the mornings to prep for their students, and then they teach for the afternoon, myself included. But, obviously we have quite a bit of experience working with these tests. And also university entrance in the US. I myself is American. I am American. Henry is American as well. Henry is the person in this picture. He's another one of our teachers. So, we sort of come from that background of doing these high stakes tests and, them being a little bit more intense in terms of the culture that they're in. So, these are the things that we work on, obviously, SSAT, ACT, SAT, PSAT, all those kinds of things, and then independent school entrance tests. So what does test prep look like? And I guess this is sort of the big question. There's no one answer to this, and this is a busy slide. So let me just move over a little bit so we're not just like inundated with words. So test prep is different for everybody. Basically, any kid who's going to do test prep is going to start with a diagnostic test. That would be a simulated test that would be either an SSAT or a sort of an in-house that we've designed test to look at where they are and what they're able to do right now. That can be done at any time. If we do a diagnostic test tomorrow, we might say, you know what, your kid is already well on their way. We probably only need to do about 10 lessons just to brush up on a few things. It also depends on the school that they're looking at, obviously. So, if we're looking at, the UCC Royal St. George's Crescent School test, and we see that their math is quite strong, but they need to work a little bit on the structure of the writing, that would be a smaller sort of smaller piece to bite off if we're looking at doing preparation. But I wouldn't make any recommendations, nor would anybody else at our company, until we've seen what they're able to do right now. If we see, they're doing a diagnostic test for the SSAT and they're placing at the 5th percentile across the board, obviously that hurts to look at for anybody, for me, for the parent, for the student. But to put it into perspective, it's not rare and it's not bad. Especially if you tell me that your kid does well in school. If you tell me your kid gets D's in school, or what's equivalent to D's in school, and they're placing at the 5th percentile, I'm going to tell you that they're not going to, it's not likely that they'll get into UTS. But if we're looking at a student who's a fairly strong student to begin with and is just struggling with the content or the format of this test, that's where we'll say, there's a bit more work to be done, and it'll probably take us, through the summer and the fall to do that preparation. Obviously, it's a give and take. So we might recommend one thing, and the reality of this kid and your family is that there isn't time to do that much preparation. And so, one of the things that I really value is just transparency and being truthful about what's possible and what's not possible. I will never, and nor will any teacher at our company, make any promises about score improvements or anything like that. We can't guarantee a score. There are variables that are out of our control, and when people tell me that they've been guaranteed a score by another place, usually what that means is that place has put a lot of fine print behind that statement. And, a lot of it is if the kid was late by a minute for one lesson, or if one homework assignment wasn't turned in, or, if the kid asked to use the bathroom for a minute during a lesson, then everything is null and void and there's nothing they can do. And obviously that's an extreme example, but there's no way that anybody can guarantee a certain amount of score improvement because we are not sitting the test for that kid. And we also are not that learner, right? So for some kids, even a really smart kid, understanding how to work with polynomials and how to, doing factorization, that might take 20 minutes. It also might take 3 1-hour lessons, depending on the kid, depending on the practice that they need, depending on how much they can retain. So, there are too many variables to, to really say that we can do X amount of work in X amount of time. All we can do is give an estimation based on our experience, the kids that we've worked with in the past, and what we know about teaching this. So really what it comes down to, if you're interested in doing some preparation and you're interested in doing one-on-one preparation, the first step would be to do a diagnostic test with us. And we can certainly, have a more in-depth discussion either before that or right after that, to talk about what's going on. If you're looking at doing a group class, we do have some group classes being offered over the summer. And if you're looking at doing, sort of at-home preparation on your own, really understanding where a student comes from can still be pretty illuminating. I'm happy to provide a diagnostic test just to give you the results, and you can sort of come up with your own plan or come back to me and say, can you help with this one thing in particular, or whatever it may be. Everything is flexible in terms of how we do things. There is no set course, with the exception of the group class, which is obviously that there are certain things that need to be taught. But really, every kid is different. So every lesson that we have is different. Every curriculum that we put together is different. And, our expectations are different as well. So, in terms of doing the preparation, I think on here it says in-person or virtual. So right now we still are only doing virtual lessons for test prep. We've offered some in-person lessons for our younger students, but for our test prep team, it's just the nature of what we do. It's easier for us to keep that online, as we continue to monitor the situation. Obviously, as things change, we'll make decisions in terms of going back to in-person lessons. But for right now, the lessons are continuing virtually, and they've been quite successful in terms of what we've been able to do. There really isn't much of a difference in terms of doing things virtually, with the exception of, actually, a lot of it is positive. Kids are more excited to, or I don't want to say more excited, but sometimes less hesitant to do the lessons because it doesn't also involve, half an hour each way of travel, those kinds of things. Okay, so the last thing to mention is just this, semi-private thing that we do. If your kid maybe wants to do this with a friend or something like that, we can put together a semi-private group class where 2 students are doing the preparation together at once, being taught by one teacher, and it's obviously at a lesser cost to both kids. Okay, so that is my presentation. I am happy to send more information. Actually, our outreach coordinator, Joelle, who sent the reminder today, will send a follow-up email either this evening or tomorrow, just to say thank you, and there will be a link to register for a diagnostic test if you'd like to do one. But if you'd like to contact me, you can certainly email me or call our front desk. My email is dan@ruthrumek.com, dan@ruthrumek.com, which is on the screen. You can also just respond back to Joelle if you'd like and say, can you put me in touch with Dan? I have some questions. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you have right now. So please flood that Q&A or the chat, and I'll get going with those. If you have no questions and everything has been answered and you are ready to move on with your evening, please do not hesitate to do so. I thank you all for being here. So I am just going to monitor the chat box for now and see if anything comes my way. So somebody was just asking about the de La Salle test because it does mirror the SSAT. It's not done on the same platform as the SSAT. The de La Salle test is done in-house at de La Salle, but it is put together by that school to mirror the actual SSAT. Another question here, is there any advantage to doing the SSAT more than once? It depends. So, in terms of score improvements, there are no miracles. It's not that one test is going to be vastly easier than another test, and that doing it twice will double your score. Generally, the two instances in which I encourage people to do more than one test, there's three actually. I'll talk about three. The first is, your kid has done the test and they said, you know what, today was really rough. I didn't give it my all. My head wasn't there. I know I could have done better. I want to try again. Definitely do it again. If that self-identification is there, 100%. The second one that I think is quite common is, you're applying to a school where the competition is extremely fierce, like UTS. And you're doing really well. You're placing at the 80th percentile, 90th percentile. And you just want to show them your best test. You don't have to send each and every test score into the schools that you're applying to. You can send just the one test that you want. So if you luck out and one test is just a little bit higher than the rest of the tests that you took, it might be to your advantage to take more than one. The last way is if you said, okay, I think we're ready, but I don't know, and it's still early on, we'll do the test. The earliest one you can do is October, and you do it and it's just not great. If you decide then to commit to doing some prep before the next one and say like do it in December and give yourself a month and a half to do some intensive prep, then yeah, there can be some improvement. But if it's just I didn't do well this week, I'm going to do it again next week and see what happens. The chances of any significant improvements are slim because the tests are very carefully designed. Okay, I have a couple more questions to answer here. So in terms of the St. Mike's score, it really depends. So there are a few things that count a lot to St. Mike's: athletics, legacy, those are big. The report card is also really big. So, SSAT scores are sort of part of the admission envelope at St. Mike's. I've worked with kids who have placed in the 30th percentile and have gotten into St. Mike's because of their athletics or because of their legacy. I've worked with kids who've placed in the 60th percentile and not gotten into St. Mike's because the rest of their portfolio was sort of not enough to bolster that score. So really, my best answer for St. Mike's or any school that uses the SSAT aside from UTS, which has a firm deadline, is to put your best foot forward in terms of every aspect of that portfolio and that application. If one part is a little bit weak, but the rest of them are strong, that's great. If one of them is extremely weak and the rest of them are sort of in the medium range, that's where they have to look at applications and say, you know what, this kid is just a stronger student all around. In terms of the latest date to meet admissions deadline for private schools, so that is dependent on the school. Most schools, UTS included, have a deadline of somewhere between December 1st and December 15th. Other schools will take admissions packages and test scores into January, but the best thing to do is to look at the admissions page of the school that you're looking for. If you're looking for St. Mike's, generally, most years it's December 15th, so just before the break. For UTS, it's usually December 1st, and that means that the test needs to be done by that date. So if you take the test on December 14th for St. Mike's, that's still fine. It's not that they need those scores by December 15th or there's nothing you can do. The application itself needs to be submitted and you need to say, I have done the test and the scores are coming. If you do an online test though, the scores take about 72 hours to come in, so it's not that big of a deal. For the SSAT, if you do an in-house on-paper test or paper test, it takes somewhere about 7 days. Sometimes it can take a bit longer if it's extremely busy. So keep the questions coming. I'm happy to sort of go over anything else. I know somebody did just come in recently. So feel free to ask any questions if you have some questions, even if it's something that you feel like I might have already covered. I'm happy to go over it again. So let me go back to the golden page of the schools and the tests, as that might be one of the questions. So somebody's just asking, what is legacy? So legacy is just if you've had family who have gone to that school in the past, particularly, if you've had a parent who's gone to that school or an older sibling, or if you've donated money, if your family's donated money, that supersedes a lot of things. So yeah, in terms of some schools value legacy a little bit more than others. Some schools, De La Salle is one of them that really enjoys having siblings go to that school. Some schools like UTS really put minimal value into it. It really is about the application and the individual student, although it can help to have a sibling. Okay. So I will stick around for a few more minutes just in case there are more questions. Like I said, if any of you have any other questions that I haven't answered, or maybe something that you don't want to ask in front of, or ask live, or it's a more private conversation, please feel free to email me. I'm happy to answer anything that you have, whether it be just a question about how to register, or things like that, or an individual school and feeling like you don't quite know if it's the right fit. I'm not an educational consultant, but I do know these schools because I work with kids who apply to all of them. And I go to the open houses. So I know these schools, I can give you at least my insight and my sort of, biased opinion. I won't call it unbiased at all, because, it's just my collection of, what I've learned over the years from working with these schools. So yeah, so thank you everybody for being here. If you, if your questions are answered and you'd like to log off, please feel free to do so. And if you have any other questions, like I said, please feel free to reach out. Just another question so two more questions I've received. This list, yes, so this list is a list of expensive schools. It is. Some of these schools are much more expensive than others. But in terms of the schools that actually use these tests, they are the private schools in Toronto. And there are a couple outside of Toronto. Appleby where is it? Not Mississauga or Oakville, Burlington, or is it in Oakville? I'm not sure. Ridley College uses a test like this. There are a couple in the Waterloo area that use admissions tests, but not the SSAT. Is Sterling Hall competitive for grade 7 entry? Not particularly, because it only goes to grade 8. So most of the time, if you're applying for grade 7 to Sterling Hall, it's through attrition. So they're just looking at which kids have already left. But there aren't a lot of seats for Sterling Hall, but there also isn't a lot of competition because you would only be there for a year or 2 years. For UTS, students in grade 5 should prep for SSAT because they need to take the grade. Yes, so for UTS, if you're looking at UTS, you should start your process of prep now. And that means, doing a diagnostic. If you're looking at doing test prep, let's book a diagnostic. If you're looking at doing, work on your own at home, buy a prep book, get as much material as you can. The prep books that are out there, some of them are great, some of them are not so great, but sitting and doing practice. So I know a lot of parents that I talk to have done LSAT or MCAT. And I've done the GRE, tests like that. You can do official practice tests over and over again and get better at them. But a test like this, the SSAT does not release previous year's tests. They release their own practice book that has practice tests in it, but those are practice tests. They're not real tests like the LSAT, where you can buy old LSAT tests. These are the tests that are released by the SSAT for practice are easier than the real test. They do that so they can keep their bell curve where it is, because they don't want too many people placing too high by preparing for their really hard tests, because then they have to make the test harder next year. If you're buying like Kaplan or Ivy Global or things like that, some of them are great, some of them are not so great, but none of them match what an actual SSAT looks like, because they're not the SSAT. So it can be helpful to go through those books, but you do need to be aware, and you should have your kid be aware as well emotionally, that the test itself will probably be pretty challenging, even if they feel pretty comfortable with the practice tests. Okay, so yes, grade 5 kids who are finishing grade 5 this year should get started. Strategize to, so somebody's asking about an IEP and was not able to get an accommodation. So that's really unfortunate. I can definitely give you some insight as to how to perhaps get that. Well, you can appeal that decision. And that's unfortunate. And if that was for the SSAT, I would strongly advise that you apply to register to take the ISEE and ask the school beforehand if they'll accept that test in lieu of the SSAT. And you can let them know that the SSAT was declined your child an accommodation. That being said, if you're looking at doing the SSAT, regardless, without the accommodation, for some kids with an IEP, if it's time management, and especially if it's ADHD, so again, like we work with a lot of kids who have a lot of diagnoses and need different kinds of support and accommodations. The extra time on the test can be a blessing and a curse for a kid with ADHD. So I'm reaching here. I don't know if this is the situation. I'm making a lot of assumptions, but I'm just talking, generally speaking, a lot of kids who get extra time, and because you mentioned time management, tend to be ADHD or ADD. A lot of those kids, when they get time and a half, are bored out of their minds. And the test itself is 3 hours. A time and a half test is 4.5 hours. So it can be a blessing and a curse to do that time and a half. If your kid gets time and a half in school and they like it, they need it on this test. There's no way around it. The reading section in particular, if you take a full, 8.5 by 11 sheet of printer paper with 12-point font, you'll have about 6 or 7 of those full pages to read with 40 questions to answer in 40 minutes. So that's not even a minute per question. That's 20 seconds per question after you've done the reading. So the timing on this test is brutal. If you get time and a half, you get it for the whole test. So that's 45 minutes per math section. That's 45 minutes for the verbal section, but it's an hour. It's an hour for the reading section, which makes things a little bit easier, but still tight. Even if even if you're an avid reader, an hour to read all of that and answer those questions it's not a lot of time, and they do that on purpose. And the questions are hard, and the reading's hard. It's all a difficult test. It's a terrible test. I hate it, but it is the reality of the world, and it's sort of. I like test taking, so I sort of fell into this, and I like working, and the teachers that work with me, we really like watching kids progress through this and champion it. It's exciting. So yeah, I please, if I haven't fully answered this question about well, actually, I didn't answer your question because you asked me how to strategize time management and teach it to middle level students. It's a lot. Teaching it to a high school student can be a lot. And I still struggle with time management. But, really, I think the core of it is to understand prioritization. Not every question deserves your time. Question number 1 through 10 might be garbage questions, or put a pin in it and save it till the end questions. But kids are not trained to do that. So, if your first reading section is poetry, skip it. Who cares? 6 questions. That's going to take you half the time to read a poem and answer those 6 questions. Just come back to it at the end if you have time. Looking at, direct evidence questions. In line 1, the author mentions this. Those you don't even have to read. Get to it, answer it. If you're looking at math for timing, if you have a word problem that's, that has a lot of information in it, that's going to take you a long time. If you read a question and you say, I have no idea what I'm supposed to do, move on. But, it's easy to say it. It's very difficult to internalize it and practice it. So like a kid will pretty immediately get, I get it. I get what you're saying. That's fine. We're working in a lesson. I can say, or a teacher can say, let's skip this question, and the kid can buy into it very quickly. But doing homework and doing the real test are very different situations. It's a high stakes, high stress situation, like I mentioned, and kids very often revert back into their sort of comfort zone or what they know because they're stressed out and they're scared. And so regular, testing environments, regular check-ins, watching them do that work, calling them out when they're not doing it, calling them out when they're not following the strategies in a nice way. Obviously, we're not going to, say like, how dare you not use my strategies, but calling out regardless. That takes time and practice and effort and commitment on the part of the adult who's working with that kid. But yeah, it's not just for kids with an IEP or kids with an LD or a learning disorder. That's for every kid. Just understanding how this test works and how it's different from what they've had to do in the past. But yes, anonymous attendee, I don't know who you are, who asked that question, but please email me if you want to discuss this more. I'm happy to sort of get into more of the strategies or how you might go about appealing that decision. Because generally, I've actually never heard of them denying an accommodation if a kid has an IEP. That's awful. That's awful. I'm sorry that happened. So like I said, I'll hang out in case anybody's typing a question or thinking of how to phrase one or anything else. I'm happy to answer as they come in. But to the rest of you, thank you so much for being here, and please email me if you have any questions. Thanks all. Thanks for being here. Okay, so to the rest of you who are still here, thank you for being here this evening. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening and a nice weekend. It looks like it's going to be at least partially nice this weekend. Maybe no trees will be knocked down. But yeah, thanks for being here. And please, like I said, any questions that you have, send them my way, and we can go from there. Okay, have a wonderful evening.